Welcome to Fathernetics, Fatherhood Unfiltered. I'm Jamil. Welcome to the podcast.
Do it. You can never find somebody do it like me. I'ma turn it all the way up, cause it kamikaze. Go ahead and try, baby. You are gonna see that you'll never ever find
All right, hi
somebody
guys,
do it
welcome
like
back.
me.
As promised, we're going to start having guests on our podcast, and today's guest is none other than my husband, Nicholas. I'll let him introduce himself real quickly, and then we'll get into a couple of different topics and questions and conversations that we've prepared, but certainly want to make sure that we don't forget that you guys' engagement, questions, comments, feedback, recommendation is definitely encouraged. And yeah, let's go for it. Nicholas?
You can call me Nick. Nicholas makes me feel like I'm in trouble. Sorry for the heavy breathing in the background, but there's a big dog next to me. I'm 5'10", but my driver's license says 5'11". I'm an Aquarius with a Libra rising. What else do you want to know?
Well, okay, well, let's take a brief moment. And how did we meet? Without going into terrible details.
We met on back at the dawn of the internet. We met in a chat room. Are we allowed to say the name? Gay.com?
Yeah, gay.com. It doesn't
that
exist
thing?
anymore, but that just tells you how old we are.
Yep. And we met in a chat room, and you had the cutest little photo that was the scanned version of a printed photo. And because camera phones didn't exist then. And that was it. I didn't have a photo. And then you drove out to see me, and we went on a date. And it was fun. And here we are.
Yeah, it was the last week in November, roughly, 22 years ago now that we've been together. We've lived everywhere from Texas to California to now Arizona. So it's been quite the journey. We feel like we have a lot to say, a lot of experiences, but as this podcast is designed to do, we want to, make sure that we have the conversations that allow for different perspectives, different insights, as we grow and our opinions adjust and change. Some of them are solidified and don't change. These conversations and topics are key to the growth that we're experiencing in our lives as far as LGBTQ couples are concerned as well. So let's get into it. So one of the questions that I had for you is, how did you know that you wanted to be a dad, or when did that become comfortable for you?
I don't know that I was ever ready to be a dad. There wasn't a light bulb moment or a switch that was like, oh, now's the time. I think it was you.
Yeah. So when I came to you and I was, thinking about, expanding our family, and I had that conversation with you, right? Hey, are you interested? Is this something you wanted to do? I think from earlier on, it was always an option, but now it needed to be, hey, for reality's sake, is this something we were ready to do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So there wasn't anything like a biological clock ticking on my side. It was very much, that may be a good idea. And then it happened.
Yeah, it happened pretty quickly. I knew I've always wanted to have kids. It's one of the things that I think most couples think about. Not all of them. Some of them are perfectly happy not having any kids, but certainly wanted to have at least one child. I never saw myself having more than one, but it was certainly an intriguing part of the next step in our evolution. So I think one of the first steps that we took is going to an adoption agency to better understand what that looks like. And it was through the state. Obviously, prior to then, we did a lot of research on what adoption was and surrogacy and whatever options were available to us as gay couples. And, I talked about this before in my intro podcast, that I was writing a book about what that process looks like, right? The adoption process, how we engage certain folks, some of the challenges that we experienced in that arena, the stereotypes, the stigmas, the things that kind of held us back. But I think now that we are parents, we have an opportunity 2020 to look backwards on that entire experience. How would you say we did navigating the adoption world as an interracial LGBTQ couple?
Well, with all of my white privilege, I wasn't really too plugged into the interracial part of it all. But I think the process is pretty textbook, at least the one that we followed through the state and getting licensed and going through the school. And we did like a series of classes and to qualify to get our license. And so that was pretty eye-opening. A lot of their perspectives, they did a really good job of sort of giving us insight into what the mindset of some of these children were going to be, which I thought was impactful and insightful. And then, I think we were really fortunate with the way, are we saying his name? The way our child's came into our care, because he was really our second placement, and our first one I never even met because I was out of town and it was less than 24 hours. And he sort of ended up with us by happenstance, and then was already at the end of his journey to being severed, which is what the states call when they are on the verge of severing the parental rights, birth parental rights.
Not the TV show, right?
Right, not the TV show, which then makes the child eligible for actual adoption.
So let me take you a step back. I think the classes themselves were pretty good. I think they did a very good job of being very transparent in the type of situational circumstances that any of those in the class could find themselves in, from the good to the bad, and some of the reasons why children go into the foster care system from young ages all the way up to teenagers, and provide us statistical numbers of the number of kids that are in the system today, and it's over 12,000 kids, right, in Arizona.
I think that's what sort of reinforced early on that we were doing the right thing, because we discussed, I think you said this a couple of minutes ago, we did the surrogacy talks and trying to find a biological path to birth a baby. And then, that started to feel like we were forcing something. And then once you get into those classes and you start hearing about the scenarios that these kids who need homes, who need families are coming from, as opposed to finding a way to create life, plugging into life that's here and facilitating like the needs of it, and being able to pick up and be a champion for that, like that was more impactful. Like, I guess early on for me, that was like, okay, yeah, we're doing the right thing in those classes. That's sort of where, can I ask you what, were there any surprises in the process that you weren't expecting?
So before I answer that question, what you may hear in the background is our dog. Her name is Bear.
Hi, Bear.
She's 85 pounds, 90 pounds.
95 pounds of fluff.
Can you tell them what is her pedigree?
She is a noodle, half Newfoundland, half poodle, or a Newfie Poo. You pick. I like noodle better.
Well, what is in the name Newfie Poo?
Newfoundland poodle. Newfoundland poodle.
Saint Bernard.
There's a Saint Bernard in there somewhere, so she's a Saint Newfie Poo.
Yeah.
She's a little saint puppy.
So she stands a little bit taller than waist height for us, and is certainly quite the personality.
You gonna say hi, Bear?
No. Don't do that. But to answer your question, I think one of the things that surprised me the most is my reaction to some of the questions. I will never forget it. It felt almost like a shopping list of things to choose from, but it was a human being, right? How old, what race, what sex, those were all questions we were asked, and it was you couldn't say, just give me a boy. It had to be, a black child between the ages of 1 and 3, or 3 and 5, or you can make that, you can expand on
preference
that.
On gender.
Certainly. And they're all preferences, right? But it felt so particularly specific not a lot of straight parents or parents who are having natural born children would even contemplate that. You just get what you get.
Unless you're in Gattaca. You
Okay.
get to build your baby.
True. When we get into genetic modifications and things of that nature, but that's not a topic for today. But those were the things that surprised me during that training course. And one of the things that I focus on in the book that I'm writing about this is our experience with our former dog and our then trainer, and how we had to find ways to make the dog not exist based on the fact that
Oh, no.
if you remember when she visited,
Yep.
our former dog, Cocker Spaniel, her name was Gia, and she took advantage of getting a little bit too close to the trainer who had come by the house to do a test home inspection, if you will.
Yeah.
And Gia lunged at her and took a bite out of her face. It wasn't all that tragic. It was a scratch for sure. It did draw blood.
It was a scratch by a tooth.
Right, scratch by tooth. And it did draw blood. And we were apologetic. She was uber nice about it. She was saying it wasn't an issue. She had dogs. But I think, because it's a workplace issue, an injury, she had to report it. And her boss was...
Yeah. She did her job.
Yeah, she did the right thing. Her boss was like, no, the dog's got to go or you are not going to get a kid. So we did end up playing a lot of shuffling with the dog between ourselves and Nick's mom and his brothers. We found the way through.
For context, this was a very elderly Cocker Spaniel who was nearing the end of her life anyways and already had health complications. So rehoming wasn't necessarily an option, but I do think we made it fit. And we were able to keep the dog and the child separate for the required amount of time. And she's no longer with us. So since you asked, I'll tell you what my most surprising part of the adoption process
Yeah,
was.
thanks for that.
I think what's interesting is we went into this with the intent to find a child and grow our family, permanent adoption, right? I know that a lot of people foster for different reasons, and sometimes permanence isn't their goal, and they're looking just to sort of be a pathway, a safe harbor for a lot of these children as they move through whatever their final life path is. But our goal was to adopt and to find a kid. And in that very specific scenario, what really caught me off guard was one of our child's birth parents, the biological father, was very active in the reunification process that adoption was, or the state was asking of him. And he was really, really fighting for his kids. And the sad truth is that his best wasn't good enough. And there was an ongoing addiction issue and safety issues and safety concerns and re-exposure to the kids in unsafe environments. And all that being said, it was very clear that he did love these kids, just didn't have the skills or equipment in this life to be a safe parent. And that was probably like the most shocking thing for me emotionally, because there was one point in time where it sort of hit me that the future success of our family depended on his failure. And that really messed me up in the head, because I want to root for everybody, and he really was giving it his all, and that was really clear. It just wasn't good enough. And that, then like, what are we doing? Are we stealing, robbing from other families? And that really messed with me, because just the whole concept of our success depending on his failure, really, it got to me. I had a hard time with that.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
And something that the classes didn't prepare us for.
Yeah, I don't think that piece is covered a lot. The psychological piece for the foster parent, and for clarity, we did foster to adopt through the state, which I think is the only way to actually adopt through the state. So just straight out adoption through the state, again, to be repetitive, is not an option. So you would have to go through a period of actually fostering before you are uniquely aligned to someone who is in the same scenario, right? Ready for severance, and a forever home is what they call it. And of course, that goes through all sorts of hoops to include court and legal activity and the road to reunification, won or loss, as Nick was referencing. So those are all things that are part of the consideration process for that.
Yeah, the state does a really good job of putting a lot of emphasis on reunification, and they're very clear with you that that is always the intended goal, is to get these kids in the foster program back with their birth parents. That is always the priority, and it doesn't matter how great of a household you put together and how stable you are and what kind of life you're able to give these kids. Like, if the parents meet the bare minimum and are doing, whatever it takes to get these kids, whatever requirements the state lays out for them, they will give them as much rope as they need to keep trying and trying and trying. And so that creates its own like sort of emotional turmoil, because you're like, wait, over here I can do all A, B, and C. And so, yeah, I think too, like, just again, we had a really sort of easy case in the sense that we met our kid early on. He was near the end of that severance process, and he'd already been in care for, I think, 2.5 years at that point. But even then there was still, I think it still took nearly 3 years between when we first met and when we went through the adoption process. And there's probably about a year gap in between the actual severance and when our official adoption took place. And, while everyone is telling you that they're rooting for you, his caseworkers and attorneys and stuff like that, after severance, there's always that possibility that a family member comes forward or that someone comes forward. So like, until the adoption is actually done, it is this like purgatory.
Pins and needles.
Yeah. And you're just so worried. I think I told you at one point, like, if anything happens and we lose him, there's no way I can do this again. Like, it was just such an emotional roller coaster. It would have felt like a death at that point. So yeah, it's the classes did a great job of like preparing us for the mechanics of what it was going to take. Mostly, I think, from the child's perspective, but it was just such an emotional process for me. Like,
so I can't imagine those who go through a more extensive process of kid after kid. I mean, we had 2. Technically, I had 2. You were in Vegas when the first one came through, and that was for 2 days. That was just for 2 days, and then there was our kid. So for other parents, they have 3, 4, 5, 10, whatever that number happens to be that they go through this cycle with, and until they've matched up correctly with their forever child, whether it is their second, third child that they're adopting or their first. So, and we even have friends that have gone through the process and had a completely different experience to what we've had with our kid. So, our story is more fairy tale compared to theirs. But at the end of the day, one of the reasons we chose to go down this path has a lot to do with the financial costs of going through this process. As we look through, adoption and surrogacy, I mean, the numbers were up there.
Expensive.
It was prohibitive, right? For a lot of families, it's just not an option. But doing it this way, foster to adopt, it was free. Everything was paid for by the state, even through the legal process. So if anyone out there is considering fostering to adopt through the state, search your soul, search your hearts. It could be the option for you. And if you guys have questions, feel free to, leave them in the comments. We'll answer as best as we can.
There are some ongoing perks too. Like, because he was in the foster program, and I think this may just be an Arizona thing. But when he's college ready, as long as he goes to a state school in Arizona, his tuition is covered because he came through the foster system, which is a great perk for us, alleviating some of that financial burden when it comes to his education, providing he goes to school here in Arizona.
Yep.
Otherwise, he'll be taking out loans.
Yep. Absolutely. One of the things that I tried to do earlier on was part of the research component that I was talking about. Try to find books that I could read that were from the LGBTQ perspective on adoption that would shine a light on the process. I didn't find any earlier on. I gave up. I just kind of read some of the standard adoption books. It didn't resonate. So going through the process was still good because I got a lot of information, a lot of missteps, a lot of feedback that I got from third party agencies, of faith or of whatever that were not very supportive of an LGBTQ plus couple reaching out for adoption of any kind, even with the big numbers of kids in the foster care system. So one of the things I hope to alleviate in writing my book is at least providing that source of no for some folks who are interested in the process.
Yeah, I think you'd be surprised what is out there that isn't, or how many like remnants of laws or legislation is still out there. I think there is a law currently on the books in Arizona that, all of our caseworkers said no one really listens to anymore, and it's at the judge's discretion. But what is have essentially given the judge the ability to deny our adoption on the grounds that we were a same-sex couple. Again, all of the legal experts we were talking to said that doesn't really happen anymore, but the grounds were still there. They certainly could have, and it would have created more emotional chaos and legal chaos for us. So like there still is a lot of, I think, clearing the path there. What about like the outcome of the adoption? So then we went through everything and then you became a parent. What was that like, that transition?
It didn't sink in right away. I think going through the legal formalities of, going to court and, sitting through a lot of those sessions with the bio parents and listening to all of the things that they had to do, they had a list of classes and measurements and metrics that they had to meet.
Because as the foster, just for everyone listening, as the foster family, you're very much involved in the reunification plan. And there's a lot of overlap. A lot of times there are probably scenarios when there aren't, but there is a lot of overlap between yourself and the birth parents. If they're still actively engaged in a case plan, meaning you are very often sitting across the table from them and hearing what their activities have been, and what measures they're taking to check the boxes for their reunification plan. It can be awkward. I think we were in some very uncomfortable, awkward meetings with the birth parent.
Well, that's where you learn the details of the initial separation as well. What caused them to get into the system? So I can imagine from their perspective, it's probably a high degree of embarrassment that goes with, the person who's taking care of your child being in the courtroom.
Yep.
But, from those meetings going to our court meeting, which was just us for the adoption, right? After we've got the attorney and the paperwork's been filed and the judge said, come see us. And we went through that formality, taking a photo with the judge at the end that said, hey, we're done. This is now your kid. Mm-hmm. That was such a proud moment for us, having navigated years of this process. And then now knowing that we were now the end all be all for this kid. We were the everything leaving that courtroom. I would say it took a few months for it to really sink in. Like, this kid's not going anywhere. There's no risk of the bio parents coming in and swooping in at the last minute that we've been living with for
so
a
you
while.
Think that's where parenting really started once we were on the other side of that? That was a couple of years.
No, that's not when it started. That's when it became real. I think it started the day we got him, right? Because then that was a change in mind.
Yeah.
What are we watching? What are we eating? What are we saying? What is he repeating?
Yeah.
Our schedules changed. We now had to take him to daycare. We had to pick him up. Was daycare appropriate? Was it the right one? We even looked into things like, should we move daycares? And, there are a lot of details that go into what the state continues to do through the fostering process. And then that changes once your child is adopted, like paying for preschool and the monthly stipends and how much that is. There's a limit. There's a budget, right? You can't pay $1 million for every kid in the system, but it does require you to think about how much you're willing to spend on some services, and then really think about what other parents that don't have the opportunity to be, what's the word I'm looking for, subsidized, have to go through daycare for 3 or 4 kids every week.
I don't know how people do it.
Wow. I mean, just trying to do it for one child was new to us. It's like, okay, now we have to carve space out in our budget. Even though we're getting subsidized, we still had to think about carving space into our budget. So that's, to me, that's part of parenting. And then taking the time to research your child and all of the potential challenges that they may have as they continue to grow up as a result of the neglect that they experienced, and making sure that that is front and center. How do you care for them? The things you buy them, how they react, their behaviors, all of that together, I think for us happened like within the first month.
Yeah.
They were all like aha moments, one after the other.
There was a
That we
moment,
didn't learn in class.
Yep. There was a moment where you were traveling shortly after we got him the first time. And, for 14 years at that point, it had just been you, me, and a dog. And so, you were on a work trip and it was like 10:30 at night and he was already asleep. And I was like, oh, I want ice cream. And, this was probably just before Uber Eats was a thing. And, I was trapped. And so there was like this like panic that I felt like I had a living creature or being, not creature, but a living being in the home that I was responsible for, that I couldn't leave. And our home was still new to him. Like, what if he woke up and was freaked out? Like, there was just no scenario where I could like get up and go get ice cream the way I had for my entire life before that. And I think that's like one of the differences between like not having any kids, and I almost feel like with the birth of a child, you have that ramp up period where you're sort of easing into or warming up to the idea of being a parent. Once the kid is here, obviously it's a totally different world. But with the foster process, it's like one day you have a kid and then the very next day, or you don't have a kid and then the very next day you do. And it can happen so quickly. That freaked me out a little bit. That little, I want ice cream and I can't go get it. Like, I was like, what have we done?
Yeah, it's
I
like
felt really
you can't
trapped.
back out. There's no takesy backsies.
Right. Yeah.
Like, you're here. This is it. We're gonna go through it and experience it the best we can. And I think for the best, for the most part, we did the best that we could with what we, as most parents do, right? They go through it, they learn it, they fumble, they try again, they find a different way. And I think through this podcast, we'll be able to create a community that has the opportunity to have conversations about what works, what doesn't work, what you and I did in raising our child, and some of the challenges we experienced, and what others may have done that is slightly different, maybe the same, or has changed or has been modified based on, societal interactions and things of that nature. So one of the last questions that I have is, now that we're parents and we're dealing with an incredible new world in 2025 going into 2026, how do we continue to teach and encourage our child to be open-minded and diverse, and not accepting of everything, but accepting of the right things?
Yeah. I think that's confidence in who he is. Because if we can get him to a place of secureness with what he knows to be right and wrong, and what his own morality and choices are in life, that, I think so much of like the divisiveness that we see in the world with racism and homophobia and sexism all comes from a place of insecurity, right? And so it's the people who are reactive to that, I feel like, take the way other people live their life sometimes as an attack on who they are. And that's where you get that sort of reactive defensiveness that will manifest as racism or homophobia or something like that. And so I think just giving him like all the tools he needs and helping him figure out that he can be a great person independent of everyone else. Hopefully my thoughts are that that positions him to be less reactive or less threatened by people who are different and have different religions and celebrate different holidays and don't do things the way he does them. And I think a lot of times when we see people that do things differently than we do, there's, that human, I'm right and you're wrong. Someone has to be right or wrong. And sort of that internalization of there are multiple ways to do things. There are multiple paths to success. And just because someone is doing something over here and is doing it well and succeeding at it, doesn't mean that removes an opportunity for me. It doesn't mean that I have to do it the exact same way to replicate that success. And I think any scenario where he gets to show up and just be himself and secure in who he is, allows him to navigate those moments neutrally without it being perceived as an attack on who he is. That's what my primary goal as a parent is to help him get to.
Yeah, I think one of my fears is just the way that I am navigating this for him, if that makes sense. It's more of my growth because I have a child and trying to help him navigate his friends now having a voice and saying things that they're repeating from their parents, or asking questions, why do you have two dads? Or, instilling confidence in the fact that having two dads is okay. That is normal.
Yeah.
Or being confident enough to say, I'm proud to have two dads. We don't want him to say that just because. We want him to actually feel that. But to get there on his own, to actually really feel it. Or, his interactions with people of different color, different races, and the things that they may say, just based on my own experiences. I'm trying my best not to put that on him, because he may not experience that. Or if he experiences it, he may deal with it slightly differently. So I want to make sure to equip him enough to be able to handle those situations. What I look forward to is an amazing human being that we've produced.
We are not producing
Like,
him. I feel like we are giving him a path to produce himself.
Produce in the sense that we have armed him to then become the person that he will be. Not that he will be exactly who we told him to be.
Yeah.
We want him to be his own person. I think it's important for him to discover himself, to identify himself, to find him somewhere, whether that's in high school or in college or wherever that happens to be. We're going to be proud of him regardless of what the outcome is, because we know it's rooted in what we're trying to teach him today.
Yeah. You're going to say that when he's a murderer one day.
Oh, well.
Unconditional love is a hard lesson. And I think something that a lot of people don't get. I think to your point about like seeding him with our own issues, like as an extreme introvert myself, like when I see kids at the park like run up to each other, stare at each other, and then they're off playing together, or he just like met some strange kid in the street the other day and they started playing basketball together, that riddles me with so much anxiety. And everything in me wants to say, hey, knock it off, don't talk to that other kid, like you're bothering them, you're doing this. But that's all me. And so I have to learn what to edit and like be aware of my own thoughts. And to your other point earlier, I got some really good advice. I don't know if I heard it at Reddit. Maybe I read it in Reddit. But the advice was to sort of like narrate what you're thinking out loud for these kids. Cause that so much of our internal dialogue that outlines why we choose to do certain things throughout the day, are a lot of times are missed opportunities to guide the kids in the right direction or show them this is what a glimpse into my decision making as an adult looks like. And so that was really good advice, just like narrating what you're doing, why you're doing. And I think we do a lot of that when politics does come up in the house, he's sort of at that age where his friends are becoming more and more aware of that. And, we certainly aren't devoid of beliefs or political opinions there, but narrating out loud. And I also find myself in narrating to him that I am also talking to myself as much as I'm talking to him, and that being respectful of other people's points of view, you don't need to necessarily understand exactly where someone else is coming from to accept the fact that you have differences of opinions. And so I think that's where narrating your thoughts and genuinely not missing an opportunity to sort of parent yourself or the little child inside of you alongside of your own kid. It's probably a good topic for a future podcast to dive into that. But I think those are all good opportunities to help guide him, or at least provide a path to navigating those positions where there are extreme points of view.
Practicing what you preach. I think that in itself is a challenge
surprisingly
for
hard
us
to do.
Right. We all think that we do it, but then
We don't.
When other people
Spoiler
are
alert.
watching you, especially a little kid that's going to emulate exactly what you just did and said not to do. It's like, oh, okay.
But that's where I think like being present with your own thoughts and that narrating, and when I'm talking to him, I'm really talking to me, really comes into play, and that walking your own line. Because I mean, like, we all know how to lose weight, right? Put the fork down. Barring some genetic disorder, that's usually the path to weight loss. And so it's not rocket science. And we all know a lot of ways to be great. And I think it is sort of human nature to assume that what you think you know means that you're going to do. And there's a big gap between knowing something and doing something. So putting into play what we know to be true is hard. And it's something that I'm constantly talking to him about, something I'm constantly talking to myself about. When I'm talking to him, I am talking to myself about it. Like, that's an important element to all of this, is you do have to emulate a lot of the human behavior, adult behavior you want out of these kids. And I also find that giving them compliments in the context of what you want to see out of them, like, oh, you're so trustworthy. I'm really proud of how brave you were in that moment. Even if they, were crying on the sidewalk for the past 5 minutes because they saw something that scared them. I think sort of like proactively, whether it's congruent with what their actual behavior is in that moment, but rewarding them, like, here's what I'm recognizing in you, gives them also something to sort of aspire to too. And I think they're more likely to work for being an honest person when you give them accolades about being honesty and trustworthy versus saying stop lying, right? They're less likely to say, oh, I don't want to be a liar, but more likely to want to enforce that virtue of being an honest person. So I think that's probably just a different version of narrating what you want to see out of them.
No, I think that's fantastic. I think we could talk about this forever. So with that, I want to say thank you for taking the time to be on my podcast, my adorable, loving husband. Thank you so much. And then we'll have more for everyone as we continue to have Nick as a reoccurring guest on this podcast, because between him and I, we have a lot of information to share, good, bad, or indifferent. We want to share it so that we can open a dialogue again and be able to pull in a lot of different thoughts and opinions. So thank you, Nicholas.
Thanks. I love you. I love you too, Bear.
Go ahead and try, baby. You are gonna see that you'll never ever find somebody